At 6:52 on a Saturday evening, my sister posted a photo of 40-some members of our extended family standing in front of our parents' orchard barn, string lights glowing behind them, and captioned it, "Family Reunion 2024. No room for outsiders this year, just us." Red, and then she tagged every single person in that photo, plus another dozen relatives who weren't even there in a post set to public. I wasn't in the photo. I hadn't been invited. Nobody had told me there was a reunion happening at all. The second shock came about 4 minutes later when I opened the Callaway Family Orchards Facebook page, the business page I had personally built and managed for 6 years, back when I still lived 20 minutes from the farm instead of 300 miles away, to see if maybe the reunion had been posted there too. It had same photo, same caption slightly reworded for the business audience, "Nothing beats family and cider donuts. This is what Callaway Orchards is really about." I was no longer listed as an admin on that page. I checked 3 times before I believed it. 6 years of posts I had written, photos I had taken, promotions I had run during our busiest pick-your-own seasons, and my name had simply been removed from the list of people with access, with no notice, no conversation, nothing. Here's a question for you if you're watching this. Have you ever found out you'd been erased from something before anyone bothered to tell you it was happening? Drop a comment. I'm genuinely curious how common this actually is, because for about 10 minutes that Saturday night, I sat on my kitchen floor in Cincinnati, 90 minutes into a phone call with my husband Marcus that had started as, "Let me show you something weird," and had turned into me crying so hard I could barely get words out, and I felt like the only person in the world this had ever happened to. It wasn't though. It happens more than you'd think. It just usually doesn't happen on a public Facebook post with 400 comments underneath it. Because I did something that night I probably shouldn't have done while that upset, and I don't fully regret it even now. I replied, publicly on my sister's post where everyone could see it. I wrote, "Funny, since I technically still own a third of that orchard, Vanessa, would have been nice to get a call." That comment ended up with more views, more shares, and more comments than the entire post it was attached to. By Monday morning, half the town of Elk Rapids, Michigan, population just under 1,700, had an opinion about my family's business. By Sunday morning, the post had over 400 comments, and mine, sitting near the top, pinned there by sheer engagement even though Vanessa never pinned it herself, had somehow pulled more shares than the original photo. People I hadn't spoken to in a decade, old high school classmates. A woman who used to run the farm stand register with me the summer I was 17, all weighing in underneath a photo of a family party I hadn't been invited to. Someone from the local paper's Facebook page had even screenshotted the exchange and reposted it with the caption, "Small Town Orchard Drama," which got its own 300 comments within a day. Marcus kept telling me to log off, to just stop refreshing the page, and he was right. And I didn't listen to him for most of that first weekend anyway, because some part of me needed to watch it happen in real time, needed proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. My name is Erin Elizabeth Grace Callaway. I'm 38 years old. I run a small accounting firm out of Cincinnati with my husband. And until that Saturday night in September, I believed, genuinely, stupidly believed, that I still owned exactly what I'd always owned. 1/3 of Callaway Family Orchards, the farm my grandfather planted in 1961, the business my father built into something that brought 15,000 visitors through its gates every apple season. I was wrong about that. Not because I'd misremembered anything. Because, as it turned out, over the 18 months before that post went up, my ownership had been quietly reduced from 33% to just under 2%, through a process that was, on paper, completely legal, and that I had never once been properly told was happening. I need to back up and explain how the orchard was actually structured, because none of what happened makes sense without it. And honestly, until that September, I didn't fully understand it myself either, which, I'd eventually learn, was exactly the point. In 2009, my father, Harold Callaway, restructured the family business into a limited liability company, Callaway Family Orchards, LLC, on the careful advice of an estate attorney who told him it would make eventually passing the farm down to me and my sister Vanessa much cleaner and simpler than dealing with a messy inheritance later. My parents kept a small controlling interest for themselves and split the majority ownership evenly. Vanessa and I each held 33%, with our parents holding the remaining 34% between them. Vanessa had always lived closer. She and her husband Doug moved into the old farmhouse on the property in 2015 when my parents needed more hands-on help, and she took over day-to-day management, payroll for the seasonal pickers, the farm store, the pick-your-own scheduling, eventually the wedding barn rentals we added in 2019. I helped remotely where I could. I did the LLC's taxes every year free of charge because I'm an accountant and it made sense for me to handle it. I flew or drove up for every major decision I was told about. I thought that was enough. What I didn't know, what none of us outside my sister and it would turn out, my parents fully knew, was that the LLC's operating agreement contained a standard clause about something called a capital call, a formal request for members to contribute additional money toward the business, proportional to their ownership share, usually to fund major repairs or expansions. And buried in that same clause was a default consequence if a member failed to contribute their share within 30 days of being properly notified. Their ownership percentage would be diluted, permanently, based on a formula weighted against however much capital they'd failed to put in relative to the members who did pay. In March of the year before, the Orchard's cold storage building had needed a major $140,000 roof and refrigeration overhaul after a bad winter. A capital call notice went out to all 4 members, my parents, Vanessa, and me, requesting each member's proportional share. My parents and Vanessa paid theirs within the deadline. I never received the notice. Or rather, and this is the part that took me weeks to piece together, a notice was sent, but not to any address or email I had used in over 3 years. The first thing I did, the Sunday morning after my comment went viral on my sister's post, was call my mother. Not Vanessa. My mother, because some instinct in me still believed there had to be an explanation that didn't involve anyone in my family deliberately cutting me out of anything. My mother sounded exhausted before I even finished my first sentence. "Aaron, please don't do this over Facebook, come up. We'll talk in person." She told me in that first phone call that Vanessa had mentioned some paperwork changes months earlier in passing during a Sunday dinner I hadn't been at, and that she'd assumed, the way you assume things about routine business you don't fully understand, that it was nothing worth calling me specifically about. "I didn't think it meant anything had actually changed for you," she said. "I thought it was just updating things, the way businesses do." I asked her whether Vanessa had ever used the word dilution in front of her, and there was a long pause on the line before she admitted that yes, she thought she remembered hearing that word once and hadn't known at the time what it meant enough to ask a follow-up question. I drove up that same day, 6 hours, Marcus in the passenger seat, both of us mostly silent for the last 2 of them. When I got to the farmhouse, Vanessa wasn't there. My mother told me she'd gone to Doug's parents' place to give everyone room to talk, which felt, even then, like a strategic retreat more than a courtesy. My father was in his recliner in the living room, and when I hugged him, he held onto the hug a beat longer than usual, which I didn't think much of at the time, though I'd come to understand exactly why later. My mother pulled out a folder. Inside it was a copy of the capital call notice from the previous March, a formal letter, dated, referencing the roof and refrigeration project, requesting my proportional contribution of $46,200 within 30 days. It was addressed to a P.O. box in Traverse City that I had closed in the spring of 2021 when Marcus and I moved to Cincinnati. I hadn't used that address in over 2.5 years. Vanessa said she mailed it to the address on file, my mother said carefully. "I don't know why it would have been wrong, she's the one who manages the member records." I asked her a simple question. "Didn't I send you all a Christmas card every single year from our current address? Didn't Vanessa's own kids send me a thank you card last December at my actual house for the gifts I mailed them?" My mother didn't have an answer for that. She just looked, for the first time in that conversation, genuinely uncertain about her own daughter, in a way I don't think she'd let herself feel before that moment. My father, from his recliner in the next room, called out at one point, asking what all the fuss was about, and my mother told him gently that Aaron and Vanessa were having a business disagreement, which was true in the narrowest possible sense and left out almost everything that actually mattered. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to the television. And I remember feeling a strange, hollow kind of grief watching that exchange, not for what had happened to my ownership stake, but for how small and manageable my mother had needed to make it sound, just to get through that particular afternoon without upsetting him further. I asked to see the LLC's official member contact records. The actual document required to be kept on file under the operating agreement, listing each member's designated address for formal notices. My mother didn't have a copy of it anywhere. Vanessa kept all of that at the farm office in the barn. We drove over to the barn together, my mother and me, and let ourselves in with her key. The office smelled the way it always had: cedar shavings and printer toner, and the particular mustiness of a building that had been converted from hay storage decades before anyone thought to fully insulate it. My mother hadn't set foot in that office more than a handful of times in the past 3 years, she admitted to me on the walk over, because Vanessa had gradually taken over enough of the paperwork that my mother had simply stopped needing to. The member records binder was exactly where my mother said it would be, on a shelf behind a desk that used to be my father's and was now, unmistakably, Vanessa's. A different desk chair, a different arrangement of family photos, a small dry erase calendar covered in wedding booking dates in Vanessa's neat, cramped handwriting. And there, on the page for my contact information in Vanessa's handwriting, was the P.O. box I'd closed nearly 3 years earlier, with a small notation next to it, in pencil, dated 11 months ago. Confirmed current. Confirmed by whom, I wanted to know, because it certainly hadn't been confirmed by me. I flipped to the pages for my parents and for Vanessa herself, out of some instinct I couldn't quite name, and found both of their entries updated within the last year. Vanessa's own address changed twice, in fact, to reflect a brief period she and Doug had spent renting a house in town during a barn renovation before moving back to the farmhouse. She'd kept her own file current down to the month. Mine hadn't been touched since 2021. If you're wondering whether this could have just been an honest mistake, an outdated address nobody thought to double-check, I wondered the same thing genuinely for about a week. I wanted it to be that. An honest, forgivable clerical error is a much easier thing to have happened to you than a deliberate one. But the timeline didn't support an honest mistake, and I only found that out because I did something Vanessa clearly hadn't expected me to do. I asked our LLC's business attorney, a calm, precise woman named Fatima Ode who'd handled the company's paperwork since the 2009 restructuring, for the complete file on the capital call, including any internal correspondence. Fatima's office wasn't obligated to hand that over to me casually. But as a full member of the LLC, even a diluted one, I had a legal right to inspect the company's books and records under the operating agreement's inspection clause, something Fatima confirmed for me over the phone before I even drove to her office in Traverse City. She was careful on that first call not to characterize anything for me before I'd actually seen the documents myself. "I'll pull the file," she said. "I'd rather you draw your own conclusions than have me color it for you first." I drove up 2 days later, sat in her small conference room with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, and read through 11 months of correspondence while Fatima worked at her desk down the hall, occasionally checking in without hovering. What she gave me included an email chain from the month before the capital call notice went out. Vanessa had written to Fatima's paralegal, "Can you confirm what happens if a member doesn't respond to a capital call in time? Does their share actually go down, or is it more of a formality?" The paralegal's response, which Fatima had CC'd herself on, laid out the dilution formula in full. Plain detail, including a specific example calculation showing that a member contributing $0 toward a $140,000 call, while the other 3 members split it evenly, would see their ownership fall from 33% to somewhere around 2%, depending on the exact valuation used. Vanessa hadn't asked that question out of idle curiosity. She'd asked it 4 weeks before the notice went out, and she'd asked it in a way that suggested she already had a specific outcome in mind, mine. I sat in Fatima's office reading that email chain and felt something shift in my chest, a very specific, cold kind of clarity that's different from anger, though the anger came right behind it. This hadn't been carelessness. Someone had done the math in advance. Fatima, to her credit, was careful not to speculate beyond what the documents actually showed. "I can tell you what the records say," she told me. "I can't tell you what was in your sister's head when she asked that question. But I will say, professionally, in 11 years of doing this kind of work, this isn't the first time I've seen a family member use a standard business mechanism to accomplish something a court would call unfair, even if it's not, strictly speaking, illegal." Unfair, but not illegal. That phrase followed me around for weeks. The next layer came from somewhere I didn't expect, the wedding barn. Callaway Family Orchards had added event hosting in 2019, a converted hay barn, string lights, 60-person capacity, the kind of rustic wedding venue that does incredibly well on Instagram and it turns out, incredibly well financially too. I'd always assumed the barn conversion had been funded modestly out of regular business revenue, the way most of the orchard's small expansions had been over the years. It hadn't been. When I asked Fatima for the full financial history tied to that $140,000 capital call, I learned that only about $60,000 of it had actually gone toward the cold storage roof and refrigeration repair the notice described. The remaining $80,000 had been redirected, through a vote at a members' meeting I was never told was happening, let alone invited to, toward finishing out a second event space adjacent to the original barn, effectively doubling the venue's wedding capacity. That second event space had generated $97,000 in booking revenue in its first 10 months of operation. Under the LLC's standard profit distribution rules, that revenue would have been split according to ownership percentage, meaning that if I'd still held my original 33%, I would have been entitled to roughly $32,000 of it. Instead, at my newly diluted 2%, my share came to less than $2,000. I went back through 6 years of my own tax filings for the LLC that week, something I could do easily since I'd prepared most of them myself, and found the distribution I'd actually received the previous year listed, correctly, at the diluted amount. A number so much smaller than prior years that I genuinely assumed when I filed it that the orchard had simply had a slow season. Nobody had told me otherwise. Nobody had needed to, because on paper, at 2%, everything about that smaller number was technically accurate. It was only a lie in the sense that the number itself was the result of something I'd never been told had happened. I want to be fair here because it would be easy to make this sound like Vanessa built an entire secret revenue stream purely to cut me out of it. And I don't actually think that's the full truth, even now. When I finally sat down with her 3 weeks after that Facebook post, at a diner halfway between Cincinnati and Elk Rapids, neither of us willing to be on the other's turf, she didn't deny any of it. But she didn't frame it the way I expected either. I built that barn, she said, and her voice cracked on the word built. I was there every single freezing morning during construction. I was the one who handled it when a bride canceled 2 weeks out and we lost $8,000. You were 300 miles away doing our taxes once a year and calling that involvement. I told her that wasn't fair, that I'd offered more than once over the years to come up for major decisions, and that I'd never once been told there were major decisions actually happening. You left, she said. You got to leave, I stayed. I gave up a life in Grand Rapids to move back into that farmhouse and be the one who actually keeps this place running, and I watched you get an equal third of it anyway forever just for being born into the same family. I got tired of that being fair. It was the first time I understood that whatever Vanessa had done, she hadn't done it purely out of greed or malice. She'd done it out of something more complicated, years of quiet resentment about who got to leave and who had to stay, dressed up, eventually, in the legal language of a capital call she'd learned just enough about to weaponize. That diner conversation should have been the moment things started getting resolved. Instead, it was the moment I learned there was a second, much bigger layer underneath the capital call, one that had nothing to do with money at first and everything to do with our father. Vanessa let it slip almost accidentally in the middle of defending herself. You want to talk about what's actually fair? Ask Mom about Dad's appointment with Dr. Whitcomb in January. Ask her what actually happened before that trust amendment you signed off on. I hadn't signed off on any trust amendment. I told her that directly, and for the first time in the whole conversation, Vanessa looked genuinely uncertain, like she'd assumed I already knew something I very clearly didn't. The trust amendment, it turned out, had been executed the previous February, 1 month before the capital call notice, and I'd later learn about 6 weeks after my father's first documented visit to Dr. Renata Whitcomb, a geriatric neurologist in Traverse City, following months of what my mother had described to friends only as him having a rough winter. I got the records eventually with my father's own consent, once he understood what I was trying to piece together. Dr. Whitcomb's intake notes from that January appointment documented mild but measurable cognitive impairment, difficulty with short-term recall, some disorientation around dates. Nothing severe enough to be called dementia outright at that stage, but enough that Dr. Whitcomb's own notes recommended, in writing, that any significant financial or legal decisions be reviewed with a family member present, given early concerns regarding judgment and memory. The trust amendment executed 6 weeks later removed me as co-successor manager of the LLC, a role I'd held on paper since 2009, alongside Vanessa, meant to take effect only if both our parents became unable to manage the business themselves. The amendment named Vanessa as sole successor manager instead. My father's signature was on that amendment. So was a notary's. Nothing about it was forged exactly. That was almost the hardest part to sit with. He had apparently genuinely agreed to sign it in a meeting Vanessa arranged at the farmhouse kitchen table with an estate attorney Vanessa had chosen, not Fatima, present to notarize it. My mother wasn't at that meeting. She told me later she'd been at a hair appointment and that Vanessa had told her afterward it was just a routine update, nothing she needed to worry about. I asked my mother gently why she hadn't asked more questions at the time. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered, sitting at that same kitchen table where the amendment had originally been signed, turning her coffee mug slowly in her hands. Because your sister has always been the one who handles things, she said. For years, that meant I didn't have to worry about the little stuff, the insurance renewals, the pesticide licensing paperwork, the seasonal hiring. I got used to not asking. I think I got too used to it. She looked up at me then, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen from her before, not quite guilt, but close to it. I don't think I want to be someone who just doesn't ask anymore. That admission from my mother mattered more to me than almost anything else that fall, because it meant she wasn't simply choosing sides between her daughters. She was looking honestly at her own part in how easily all of this had been able to happen. A family that had, without anyone deciding to, let one daughter become the only source of information about a business that belonged, on paper, to all of us equally. I sat with my father in his recliner about a week after I learned all this, and I asked him, as gently as I knew how, whether he remembered signing that amendment. I sat with my father in his recliner about a week after I learned all this, and I asked him, as gently as I knew how, whether he remembered signing that amendment. He did remember it in fragments. He remembered Vanessa being there. He remembered a woman he didn't know well explaining some papers to him. He did not remember, when I described it to him, that the amendment removed me from any role in the business at all. I thought that was just about the barn, he said. The insurance thing for the new building. I asked him if he remembered reading the whole document before he signed it, or if he'd mostly relied on what Vanessa and the attorney told him it said. He got quiet for a while, long enough that I started to think he wasn't going to answer at all before he said, I trust your sister. I've always trusted your sister to handle the details. That's her job, isn't it? Handling the details? There was something almost pleading in the way he said it, like he needed me to confirm that trusting her had been the right thing to do, and I didn't have the heart in that moment to tell him what I actually thought. That sentence stayed with me for a long time afterward because it wasn't a lie exactly. I don't think my father was lying to me. I think he genuinely believed at the time he signed it, and still believed months later, that the document had been about something else entirely. That somewhere in the explanation Vanessa or her attorney gave him that day, the actual substance of what he was signing away had gotten lost, whether by accident or by design, in language he was, by that point, no longer fully equipped to parse on his own. I brought this to Fatima, and Fatima was blunt with me in a way I appreciated, even though it scared me. What you're describing, she said, sounds less like straightforward fraud and more like what elder law calls undue influence. Someone using a position of trust and access to get a vulnerable person to make a decision that primarily benefits the person doing the influencing, at a moment when that person's judgment may have been compromised. It's harder to prove than outright forgery, but it's not impossible, especially with medical documentation this specific. She recommended I speak with an elder law attorney directly, separate from the LLC matter, because the trust amendment and the capital call, while connected, were legally two different problems requiring two different kinds of action, one a business dispute among LLC members, the other a potential undue influence claim tied to my father's diagnosis and capacity at the time he signed. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters. For about 2 weeks after learning all of this, I genuinely considered doing nothing. Pursuing any of it meant formally accusing my sister, in front of lawyers, possibly in front of a judge, of exploiting our father's declining memory for control of the family business. It meant risking whatever relationship we had left, in a family that was already fracturing in full view of an entire town that had watched the whole thing unfold in a comment section. I called an old college friend, Priya, during that stretch, someone who had absolutely no stake in any of it, no connection to Elk Rapids, no opinion already formed from watching the Facebook thread, specifically because I needed someone to talk me through it who wasn't already emotionally inside the situation. She asked me one question that stuck with me for the rest of that process. If your dad were fully healthy right now today, would you still want to know the truth about what happened, even if it hurt him to hear it? I told her yes, without hesitation. Then that's your answer, she said. The diagnosis doesn't change whether the truth matters, it just changes how carefully you have to handle telling it. What changed my mind wasn't anger in the end. It was a phone call from my mother, 3 weeks later, telling me that Dr. Whitcomb's most recent evaluation showed my father's cognitive decline progressing faster than expected, and that decisions about his care and the business's future were going to need to be made soon by someone, and that she, my mother, did not feel equipped to be the only person making them. The elder law attorney I hired, a methodical man named Gregory Fosso, based out of Grand Rapids, laid out my options plainly during our first meeting. I could pursue a formal petition to review the trust amendment based on undue influence and my father's documented capacity concerns at the time of signing. I could pursue a separate civil claim against the LLC and against Vanessa individually for the capital call dilution, arguing bad faith in how the notice was delivered. Or I could attempt mediation first, with the threat of both of those actions as leverage, which Gregory said was usually the faster, cheaper, and, in his professional experience with family businesses specifically, often the less permanently damaging route if the other party was willing to engage honestly. I chose mediation first, not because I'd forgiven anything, but because my father was still alive, still in that recliner, still occasionally lucid enough to ask me how work was going in Cincinnati. And I didn't want the last years of his life spent watching his 2 daughters tear each other apart in a courtroom over an orchard he'd spent his whole life building. Vanessa's initial response to the mediation request, relayed through her own attorney, was a flat refusal. Her position, as her attorney framed it, was that the capital call had been executed in full compliance with the LLC's operating agreement, that the trust amendment had been properly notarized and voluntarily signed, and that she saw no legal basis requiring her to renegotiate either. Gregory told me, reading the letter aloud over the phone, that this kind of opening position was fairly standard. Attorneys rarely start from a place of concession. But I remember how much it stung anyway, seeing my sister's name attached to a document that flatly denied any wrongdoing at all, after everything the records had already shown. That refusal lasted about 6 weeks, 6 long, stalled weeks in which Gregory and I began quietly preparing the paperwork to escalate toward formal litigation instead. A prospect that filled me with more dread than satisfaction even as I signed off on each preliminary step. What changed it, according to Gregory, wasn't legal pressure at all. It was the fact that the whole situation had never actually stopped being public. My original comment on Vanessa's post had long since faded from most people's feeds, but the story hadn't faded from Elk Rapids itself. Wedding bookings at the barn, Gregory's paralegal discovered while doing background research, had dropped noticeably over the fall, and a handful of the reviews on the venue's booking site had started referencing family drama and some kind of ownership dispute in vague, second-hand terms that were doing real damage to a business that ran heavily on word-of-mouth trust. Vanessa had built something real, and the same small-town visibility that had made my comment go viral in the first place was now quietly threatening to undo the thing she'd apparently taken drastic steps to protect. Mediation started in November, 2 months after that Facebook post, in a conference room in Traverse City with Gregory on my side, Vanessa's attorney on hers, and a neutral mediator, a retired judge named Constance Reyes-Farrow, sitting between us. The first session was mostly posturing. Vanessa's attorney argued the dilution was procedurally sound and legally defensible regardless of intent. Gregory countered that the email exchange with Fatima's paralegal, asking specifically what would happen to a non-paying member's share, 4 weeks before the notice was mailed to an address I hadn't used in years, was, at minimum, strong evidence of bad faith that would not look good in front of a judge, even if it wasn't outright illegal. Doug, Vanessa's husband, came to that first session too, sitting quietly behind her rather than at the table. And I remember catching his eye once, during a tense exchange between the attorneys, and seeing something that looked almost like exhaustion, the specific kind that comes from having watched a conflict build for years without quite being able to stop it. He and I had always gotten along easily, back when things were simpler between our families, and I found myself wondering, watching him that day, how much he'd actually known about any of this before it became public, and how much he'd simply learned to live alongside without asking too many questions of his own, the same way my mother had. The second session in December was where things actually started to move, because my mother came, uninvited by either legal team, and asked to speak. She told the room, in a steady voice that surprised me, that she had found, going through the farmhouse office looking for an old insurance document, drafts of the trust amendment dated nearly 2 months before the version my father actually signed. Early drafts that named Vanessa as sole successor manager from the very beginning, well before Dr. Whitcomb's January diagnosis appointment had even happened. Constance Reyes-Farrow asked my mother to describe exactly how she'd found them. My mother explained she'd been searching a filing cabinet in the farmhouse office for a homeowner's insurance renewal that had gone missing, and had come across a manila folder labeled, in Vanessa's handwriting, estate draft language. Tucked behind a stack of old seed catalogs Vanessa had apparently never gotten around to throwing out. Inside were 2 earlier drafts of the amendment, each with handwritten notes in the margins, questions, in what Fatima later confirmed was the estate attorney's handwriting, about whether the change needed to wait for a more clearly documented reason, and a note from Vanessa herself, dated in early December of the year before any of it was finalized, that simply read, "Let's wait for the right moment, not yet." Gregory didn't need to say much once that folder was entered into the record. Constance Reyes-Farrow read the note aloud herself slowly and let the silence that followed do the rest of the work. That detail mattered more than almost anything else in the entire case, because it undercut the idea that the amendment had been some reasonable, good-faith response to a sudden medical concern. The plan, according to the drafts, predated the diagnosis. Whatever role my father's declining capacity played, it hadn't been the reason for the amendment. If anything, it had simply made the amendment easier to finalize once the opportunity presented itself. Vanessa didn't say much when my mother finished. I watched her face while Constance Reyes-Farrow asked, gently, whether she wanted to respond, and for a long moment she just looked down at the table, turning a pen over in her hands the same nervous way our own mother did, a habit I'd never noticed the two of them shared until that exact moment. "I started thinking about it after Doug and I moved back," she finally said. "Years before Dad got sick. I used to lie awake doing the math on how much of my life I was giving to that place, and knowing Aaron still got a third of it just for existing, and I told myself eventually I'd find a way to make it feel fair. I didn't plan for it to happen the way it did, but I also didn't stop it once I saw the opportunity." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was the first fully honest thing she'd said since that diner 3 months earlier, and something about hearing her say it out loud in front of our mother made it land differently than any of the documents had. Constance Reyes-Farrow, who had presided over enough family business disputes by that point to have seen nearly every version of this moment, let the room sit in silence for a while after Vanessa finished speaking before she said anything herself. "I want to say something, and it's not legal advice, it's just an observation," she told us. "In my experience, the families who come out of this process still able to be in a room together are the ones where somebody, at some point, stops arguing about what's provable and starts talking about what's true. You just did that. I'd encourage you both to remember what that felt like, because the paperwork we finish today won't be what determines whether you can sit at the same holiday table 5 years from now. This moment will." Nobody responded to that directly. But I noticed, walking out to the parking lot afterward, that Vanessa lingered by her car a moment longer than she needed to, like she was waiting to see if I'd say something else. And when I didn't, she just nodded at me once before getting in and driving away. It wasn't warmth, exactly. But it wasn't the cold distance of the diner conversation 3 months earlier either. The settlement that eventually came out of mediation, finalized in February, 5 months after the Facebook post, wasn't the clean victory I might have imagined during those first furious weeks in September. My ownership share was restored, but not to the full original 33% I once held. Gregory and Vanessa's attorney negotiated a figure of 22%, a compromise that accounted for the 18 months where Vanessa had genuinely managed the business alone and expanded it, weighed against the bad faith manner in which my original dilution had occurred. I wasn't thrilled with that number. Gregory told me honestly that if we'd pushed for full restoration through litigation instead of settlement, we might have won it. Or we might have spent 3 years and $40,000 in legal fees arguing over it in front of a judge who could have ruled either way. Given how genuinely murky the undue influence question remained without clearer proof of my father's exact state of mind on the day he signed. The trust amendment was formally revised, with both my father's updated, court-recognized limited guardianship, established that same spring, once his diagnosis progressed to a point where my mother, this time with both Vanessa and me present and in full agreement, petitioned for it, and a new provision naming Vanessa and me as co-successor managers, exactly as the original 2009 structure had intended before any of this happened. The LLC's operating agreement was also amended, at Fatima's recommendation, to require any future capital call notice to be sent via 2 independent methods, certified mail and email, with a mandatory acknowledgement of receipt, specifically to prevent the kind of address confusion, deliberate or not, that had started this entire chain of events. Fatima told me privately once the ink was dry that she wished she'd built that safeguard into the original 2009 agreement, and that she'd since started recommending it as standard practice to every family business client who walked through her door. Financially, I recovered a portion of the wedding barn revenue I'd been owed, though not all of it. Vanessa's attorney successfully argued that a full retroactive accounting going back to the original expansion would be prohibitively expensive to calculate precisely. And Gregory, weighing cost against likely gain, advised me to accept a negotiated lump sum instead of pursuing exact figures through further litigation. I took his advice. It wasn't everything I was owed on paper. It was, Gregory told me, close to what most people in my position actually end up walking away with once the cost of pursuing perfect justice is weighed against simply moving forward. The settlement also included something I hadn't expected to matter as much as it did. A formal, written acknowledgement, signed by Vanessa, that the original capital call notice had been sent to an address she knew, or reasonably should have known, was no longer current, and that the resulting dilution would not be treated by either party or the LLC's records as evidence of any failure or wrongdoing on my part as a member. Gregory told me most people skip past that kind of language during settlement negotiations, focused entirely on the dollar figures. I made him fight for it anyway. I didn't just want my percentage back. I wanted it on paper, somewhere official, that I hadn't simply forgotten to pay a bill I'd never received. The guardianship petition itself, filed jointly by my mother, Vanessa, and me that spring, was limited in scope. Gregory and Fatima both recommended what's called a limited guardianship rather than a full one, meaning my father retained decision-making authority over most areas of his life, with oversight specifically confined to major financial and legal decisions above a certain threshold. Decisions of exactly the kind that had gotten tangled up in the trust amendment in the first place. The probate judge who reviewed the petition, a soft-spoken man who'd clearly handled dozens of similar cases, asked my father directly, in a private chambers meeting Gregory prepared him for carefully, whether he understood what the petition meant and whether he consented to it. My father said yes. He also asked, according to my mother who was in the room, whether this meant his daughters would stop fighting about the barn, and the judge gently told him that was rather the hope. The hardest part of all of this, honestly, wasn't the money or even the trust amendment. It was watching my parents live inside the wreckage of a decision my father barely remembered making, while 2 of the 3 people responsible for cleaning it up were his own daughters, negotiating across a conference table instead of standing beside each other the way we had for most of our lives before that September. My father's decline continued through that winter and into the following spring, faster than Dr. Whitcomb had initially projected. By April, he needed help most days with things he'd managed easily a year earlier, remembering which of his grandchildren belonged to which of his daughters, remembering that the Orchard's Spring Blossom Festival, an event he'd personally run for over 30 years, was happening at all until someone reminded him that morning. There was one afternoon in late April I still think about often. I'd driven up for the Blossom Festival weekend, and I found him standing at the edge of the North Orchard block, the oldest trees on the property, the ones his own father had planted, just looking at them, not doing anything, not moving. When I asked if he was okay, he told me he'd been trying to remember what year they'd replaced the irrigation lines out there, a detail he used to be able to recite instantly, down to the contractor's name, and that the not remembering scared him more than almost anything else that had happened to him that year. I stood with him for a while, not saying much, just looking at the same trees, and I understood, in a way I hadn't fully let myself understand before, that whatever had happened between Vanessa and me over ownership percentages and capital calls, it was happening against the backdrop of something far larger and far sadder, a man slowly losing the specific, granular knowledge of a life's work he'd built tree by tree, decision by decision over 5 decades. Vanessa was the one who told me, in a phone call I hadn't expected, that Dad had asked about me by name 3 separate times during one difficult week in May, wanting to know if I still lived in the city with Marcus, a fact he'd apparently held onto even as other things slipped. She told me the whole story slowly, almost hesitantly, like she wasn't sure whether sharing it would land as a kindness or as something else entirely. And I remember standing in my own kitchen in Cincinnati, phone pressed to my ear, feeling grateful in a way I hadn't expected to feel toward her again so soon. She didn't have to tell me that. I think, in her own way, it was the closest thing to an olive branch she knew how to offer that spring, not an apology in words, but an acknowledgement that whatever had happened between us, our father's love for both of us hadn't been part of the calculation, and shouldn't have to be casualties of it either. I started coming up to Elk Rapids more often after that, not every week, but monthly, sometimes more, splitting the drive with Marcus so I wasn't doing 12 hours round trip completely alone. I sat with my father during some of his harder afternoons, learning, slowly, the specific patience it takes to answer the same question 3 times in an hour without letting your voice betray any frustration. I helped my mother sort through paperwork that had genuinely, legitimately become too confusing for her to manage by herself, separate from anything Vanessa had done. Vanessa and I worked out a rotating schedule for who covered which weekends, the kind of quietly practical cooperation that doesn't heal anything on its own, but that keeps a family functioning while the healing, if it comes at all, happens slowly in the background. We didn't become close again, not in the way we'd been as kids, splitting a bedroom on the 2nd floor of that farmhouse, sneaking out to eat unripe apples straight off the trees in August. I don't know if that version of us is something either of us can get back. But we started being able to sit in the same room without a lawyer present, which, 5 months earlier, standing in my kitchen reading her comment reply count climb past 404,000, eventually well over 40,000 across shares and screenshots, I genuinely hadn't believed we'd manage again. There was a specific afternoon that spring, small and unremarkable in almost every way, that I keep coming back to more than any of the legal milestones. Vanessa and I were both at the farmhouse the same weekend, by coincidence rather than plan, and we ended up in the kitchen together making dinner for our parents. The two of us moving around each other at the stove the way you do with someone you've cooked alongside 1,000 times before, without needing to talk through who's handling what. Neither of us mentioned the mediation or the capital call or the Facebook post. We just made dinner, the way we used to before any of it happened, and for about 40 minutes standing at that stove, it almost felt like nothing between us had changed at all. It had, of course, but that afternoon was the first time I let myself believe that something resembling normal might still be possible for us eventually, even if it looked different than it used to. I think about that original Facebook post more than I probably should, given everything that came after it. No room for outsiders. I've turned that phrase over so many times in the year since, trying to figure out exactly what Vanessa meant by it, whether she wrote it knowing what she'd already done to my ownership stake, whether some part of her wanted me to find out that way, publicly, humiliatingly, in front of the whole town, rather than face me directly with what she'd engineered. I asked her that, eventually, near the end of mediation, in one of the rare moments we spoke without our attorneys in the room. She told me she hadn't been thinking about the capital call at all when she wrote it. She'd been thinking about Doug's cousins that whole week, mostly a specific, smaller family conflict about who'd been invited to a barbecue the year before, completely unrelated to me at all. It wasn't even about you, she said. You weren't in my head when I wrote that caption, and I think that's actually worse, honestly, when I sit with it. You'd already stopped being someone I was thinking about at all. That admission hurt in a way I hadn't expected it to, more than almost anything else in the entire ordeal. Not because it revealed some grand scheme, because it revealed the opposite, that the sister who'd once shared a bedroom with me, who'd been my emergency contact for most of my 20s, had drifted so far from actively thinking about me at all that erasing me from a Facebook caption and a business's admin list hadn't even registered as something that required particular thought. I've thought a lot, too, about the 400, then 4,000, then eventually well over 40,000 people who watched some version of that comment thread unfold, most of them strangers, plenty of them offering opinions about my family with far more confidence than the facts actually warranted. A few of them, I found out later, were people who genuinely knew Vanessa or my parents personally, and had used the anonymity of a comment section to say things about my sister they'd never have said to her face, cruel things. Some of them about her marriage, her parenting, assumptions about her character built entirely off a single caption and my single reply. I hadn't wanted that. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to tell this story as though the internet's reaction was some kind of vindication, and it wasn't. It was just noise, mostly, amplifying a private wound in a way that made it harder, not easier, for either of us to eventually sit across a table and talk like sisters instead of like opposing parties. I don't know that there's a clean lesson in that, the kind of thing you can put on a graphic at the end of a video. I know that families don't usually break in one dramatic moment, no matter how it looks from the outside, watching one viral comment thread unfold in real time. They break slowly in 100 small absences of thought, long before anyone posts anything publicly enough for the rest of the world to notice. And I think, if I'm honest, they can also rebuild slowly in 100 small returns of thought, a comment left unread turning into a phone call, a kitchen shared in silence turning into an afternoon that almost feels normal again, long before anyone would think to call it fixed. My father passed away this past winter, 14 months after that Facebook post, gently at home, with my mother, Vanessa, and me all in the house when it happened, though not all in the room at the exact moment. I'd driven up 2 days earlier, on what turned out to be, without any of us fully realizing it at the time, the last stretch of a decline that had been accelerating for months. The funeral was small, mostly family, held at the same church where he and my mother had been married 42 years earlier. Vanessa and I sat together in the front pew with our mother between us, and at one point during the second hymn, I felt her hand find mine briefly, the way it used to when we were kids sitting through long services and getting restless, and neither of us said anything about it, then or since. Doug spoke during the service about the summer he'd spent working the harvest under my father before he and Vanessa were even officially together, about the specific, gruff kindness my father had shown him back when he was just some boy dating the owner's daughter. It was the first time in over a year I'd cried about my father specifically, rather than about anything connected to the dispute, and it caught me off guard, how uncomplicated that particular grief turned out to be, even after everything. The orchard is still running, Vanessa still manages the day-to-day. I still handle the books and now, under the revised operating agreement, sign off on major decisions alongside her, the way we were always supposed to, the way our father intended back in 2009 before either of us had any reason to imagine it would take a public feud, and a mediation table to actually make that structure mean anything. The wedding barn had its best season yet this past year, once the reviews about family drama finally faded from the venue's booking page, replaced slowly by new ones about the actual weddings people had there. I don't know if that's irony or just time doing what time does. Probably both. Fatima retired from active practice this past fall, and at her small retirement gathering, she pulled me aside for a moment and told me something I've thought about often since. Most of the disputes I handled in 31 years weren't really about the documents, she said. The documents were just where the disagreement finally became visible enough for someone to hire a lawyer. By the time people get to my office, the actual damage happened years earlier, quietly, in conversations nobody thought to have. I asked her if she thought Vanessa and I could have avoided all of it, if we just talked more sooner about how unevenly the actual work of running that orchard had come to fall on her shoulders, while mine stayed comfortably distant. She considered the question seriously before answering. Maybe, she said. Or maybe you'd have had the same conversation you eventually had in mediation just 5 years earlier and without the lawyers in the room. I've stopped trying to guess which families would have worked it out on their own. I just try to help the ones who didn't find whatever's left to salvage. I still think sometimes about the version of that Saturday night where I didn't reply to Vanessa's post at all, where I just closed the app, cried in private, and let whatever had happened to my ownership stake stay quietly buried the way it clearly would have, if a diluted 2% hadn't been sitting there waiting for someone to notice it. I don't know how long it would have taken me to find out on my own, doing the LLC's taxes the following spring, staring at a distribution figure that didn't match what I expected, and having no public comment thread forcing the question into the open before I was ready to ask it privately. I'm not proud of how publicly I did it. I've told Vanessa that directly more than once, and I mean it. There were quieter ways to start that conversation, and I chose the loudest one available to me in the worst 10 minutes of that whole ordeal. But I also don't think I would have gotten a straight answer any other way, and some ugly, honest part of me still believes that. Marcus has told me more than once since that he thinks I'm being too hard on myself about the timing of it. That a person doesn't get to choose the exact moment they discover they've been quietly erased from something they helped build, and reacting badly in the first 10 minutes after that discovery doesn't undo any of the years of good faith that came before it. I appreciate him saying it. I don't fully believe it, not yet, but I appreciate him saying it anyway. On the nights when I still replay that comment in my head and wonder whether a calmer version of myself, given the same information at the same kitchen table 9 months earlier, might have found a way to ask my sister the same question quietly instead of in front of an audience of strangers. If there's a version of closure in any of this, it isn't the kind where everyone hugs it out and the credits roll over a warm, tidy family photo with nobody missing. My sister and I are civil now, and useful to each other in the specific, practical way that co-managing a business requires, and some days that tips over into something that feels almost like the relationship we used to have. Other days it doesn't, and I've stopped expecting it to on any predictable schedule. What I've settled into instead is something smaller and more honest. An understanding that fairness inside a family isn't something that gets settled once, in a will or an LLC operating agreement drafted decades ago, and then stays settled forever after. It has to be maintained actively by people who keep choosing to see each other clearly year after year. And the moment you stop doing that, the moment someone becomes, in Vanessa's own words, someone you've simply stopped thinking about, the door is already open for something like what happened to us to happen again, to anyone in any family, whether it's an orchard, a house, a small business, or just a place at the table nobody remembers to set anymore. I think about my mother's line from that first mediation session more than almost anything else, that she'd gotten too used to not asking. I've tried to build something different out of that in my own life in the year since. I ask more questions now of Marcus, of my own small handful of employees back in Cincinnati, of the people I love generally, even when the asking feels unnecessary, even when I'm fairly sure I already know the answer. It's a small, almost embarrassingly modest thing to have taken from an ordeal this large, but I think it might be the only lesson that actually transfers cleanly from a story this specific and strange to whatever situation someone watching this might be sitting within their own family right now. The quiet, unglamorous discipline of not letting yourself stop asking, just because it's easier, for a while, to assume someone else is handling it. My father spent 30 years building something meant to hold his whole family together after he was gone, tree by tree, harvest by harvest, decision by patient decision. It very nearly did the opposite. That it didn't, in the end, that there's still an orchard, still a farmhouse kitchen table with room enough for both his daughters at it, has less to do with the legal outcome than with two sisters deciding, slowly, painfully, and without much grace at first, that they'd rather keep showing up than let one bad caption be the last honest thing either of them ever said to the other. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental. Takeaway: being technically owed something and actually being seen by your family are two different kinds of belonging, and it's possible to win back one of them in a settlement and still have to rebuild the other slowly on your own.